Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to discuss a very interesting paper here. Paper number 122, General Distribution of the Sabbath-keeping Churches. This important paper traces the Sabbath-keeping churches from the 1st century into the Middle East, Europe, and throughout Asia, covering a span of some 2 millennia. It is a comprehensive record not only of the churches but also of the lengths to which the Sunday worshipping system went to wipe them out under persecution. I'll give you a brief background. From an examination of the history of the Sabbath-keeping churches, we are able to draw some important conclusions about them and also trace a system of observance which shows that the biblical model, as established by Christ, has never ceased. There are a number of significant examples which show a sequential history of the Sabbath-keeping churches throughout the early Christian world and in Europe, before and during the Middle Ages. These continue on into and through the Reformation. The Sabbath-keeping churches, termed also Sabbatati, have existed at one stage or another over the greater part of the planet. These churches also appear to have, in their central core, from the earliest stages, kept the holy days and numerous other observances which have them stand above all others. And Wade, would you like to continue?
Yes, Roger, thank you. There's one fundamental fact that needs to be got through the head of everyone who professes to be a Christian. The Sabbath was the day of worship of the church under Christ through the whole temple period, right through the 1st century. There was no such thing as Sabbath worship, Sunday worship, outside of the Sabbath under the church until the 2nd century. The only time people worshipped on Sundays was in the Baal system of the sun and mystery cults. Sabbath was the 7th day of the week, Saturday, in all of the churches of God all the way around the world through the 1st century, and Sunday worship only came in from the worship of the god Attis in Rome in 110 AD. And they placed Sunday worship alongside Saturday worship in Rome, and only in Rome, and they took up collections on Sunday because the Sabbath they didn't exchange money or take up collections, and the Sabbath was the correct and true day of worship. Now, the reason they incorporated Sunday worship from after 111 CE was to attract these people from the worship of the god Attis in Rome, and that continued until 154 of the current era, when they elected the Bishop Anicetus as the Bishop of Rome, and he introduced the pagan Easter system. Easter is the name of the goddess, Easter. It comes from Baal worship, and it was brought in from the worship of Attis. It wasn't made a compulsory item or festival until 192, when the heretic Victor was made Bishop of Rome, and he introduced and enforced the festival of Easter, that is the Friday death, Sunday resurrection cult from Attis, and made it compulsory for communion with Rome. That created the greatest schism in the church. But right up until then, there was communion and one church, and it was keeping the Sabbath everywhere. Only in Rome did this Sunday worship intrude, and then it was used to go hand in hand with the Sabbath, but gradually it replaced it. And by the 3rd century, we were looking at Sunday worship in Rome and those associated with Rome. But the Sabbath was a general day of worship throughout the world for all the churches of God, right through the 1st and most of the 2nd century and into the 3rd. And it remained a day of worship in Britain and the Northern European systems right up through until 663 of the current era at the Synod of Whitby in Britain. So it's very important that we have that in our minds fixed. There was no such thing as Sunday worship. By the 4th century in Rome, the priests of Attis were complaining that the priests of Christianity in Rome had stolen all their doctrines. That's how serious the heresies from Rome became. And it's important that we look at how this Sabbatarian system was spread right throughout the world as we go through this very important text. The Sabbath was everywhere, and we know from 200 to 250 of the current era, that from the Oxyrhynchus papyrus in Egypt, that the Sabbath was kept right through Egypt and North Africa. And it's important that we understand that the notations here and the references, the texts are shown. And also the other writers, the Ante-Nicene Fathers, also kept the Sabbath. And Sunday worship only occurred from Rome, and then it spread by force of arms through in liaison with these other nations that kept Baal worship and Sunday worship. So you see those references, like the Constitution of the Holy Apostles and the Ante-Nicene Fathers, shows that thou shalt observe the Sabbath on account of him who ceased from his work of creation, but ceased not from his work of providence. It is a rest for the mediation of the law, not for idleness of the hands. These are the standard statements of the fathers of the church in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. Now, you'll see also that Sabbath keeping was the original position of the church, and it spread into Europe, and from Palestine it spread east into India. And you can see that in Mingana, The Early Spread of Christianity, volume 10, page 460. And it then went into China, spread there by Muses, the Archbishop of Abyssinia. The introduction of the Sabbath system into India caused a controversy in Buddhism in 220 of the current era. So it was quite a problem, and the Buddhists started to keep the Sabbath, and that caused a problem. You see that in the Creed of Half Japan, page 23. And in the Kushan dynasty of North India, called a council of Buddhist priests at Vaisalya to bring uniformity among the Buddhist monks on the observance of their weekly Sabbath. And some had been so impressed by the Old Testament writings that they had begun to keep the biblical Sabbath. So the Sabbatarians, or the Sabbatati of Europe, were not an inconsiderable force, and the church established in Milan kept the Sabbath, as we saw and see, and the references are in Highland's History of the Sabbath, and the texts are in this work, so that the Sabbath is documented in all areas meticulously over the period, so that we all know what's happening. And the introduction of Baal worship, Sunday, Christmas and Easter, was implemented from Rome under these worshippers of the god Attis, who had penetrated Christianity and took it over. And it's important that we understand that that's what happened. And there was no Hillel calendar at this time. It's most important also to understand the Jews hadn't even adopted and manipulated the Hillel calendar. The Babylonian intercalations that became the fundamental issue of the Hillel calendar were still kept in Babylon in the ancient Babylonian religious system, and Christians didn't have anything to do with it, nor did they keep Hillel until even when it was introduced in 358 of the current era. The Christian church had nothing to do with it, either in the Sunday worshipping, Baal worshipping sections, or in the Sabbath-keeping sections either. Nobody had anything to do with the Hillel calendar until 1940, when Herbert Armstrong and Andrew Duggar introduced the heresy to Christianity in the United States of America through the Sardis system. And it's that serious and that late. This Sabbath-keeping system, as we will see, is a fundamental test of the faith, along with the doctrine on the nature of God. Well, gentlemen, you might look at this stuff and we can... we saw how it fell into neglect in the West under the Goths, and they were then trying to expel the Sabbath and trying to... In the end, they started to kill the adherents of the Sabbath when they had the power.
And it still goes on today in a way, doesn't it? I mean, even some of these churches of God that are out there allow members to do certain things on the Sabbath that really aren't keeping the Sabbath. They say to them, it's a day of rest, and literally that's what they do. They don't engage with the Bible, they don't engage with understanding.
These heretics in the Sardis system in the 20th century began to teach that it was all right to go to restaurants on the Sabbath to buy items from trade on the Sabbath.
Right.
And they did not keep the new moons, even though the church kept the new moons with the Sabbaths all the way up through to the end of the 19th century under the systems in Europe until the end of the Thyatiran era. The Sardis system never kept the new moons, and they then purchased items on the Sabbath and taught the ministry engaged in it and taught the brethren that it was okay to trade. No, keep the new moons, that's not required, and you can trade on the Sabbath. You can go and buy food as an ox in a ditch. You can go to a restaurant because they're not really your manservants and maidservants. You can use them to do anything because it's not a relationship. They'd be open anyway.
That was the premise, that's right.
That's the premise. And you hear that heresy come out of the mouths of these ministers of this Sardis system through all of Armstrong's offshoots and things, and they will be punished. That will be stopped in a few years' time, and if you do those things, you will pay for it.
And they're oblivious to the errors, the Hillel. They just do it, and they think there's nothing.
Well, they won't listen.
Nothing else.
The Sardis system is dead completely in all of the offshoots of Sardis, in all of the elements in the churches of God's seventh day, and all of those systems, and they have to be stamped out.
Right, it even shows it, Revelation 3:1.
Yes.
They are dead, and there's even one that had the audacity, even though it's been written for 1900 years, that says that it's living.
Yes. Well, that's the correct Revelation 3:1. You have the name that you're living, but you are dead. there has never been a living Church of God until it was named and formed as out of the global system in 1998, before the Passover of 1998. And that was the demarcation church of the Sardis system, and that was the marking of the system and its placement at the reading, the judgment and measurement of the temple, so that that system will be punished. These churches keeping the Sabbath, the church has done its best to maintain the Sabbath, and as we will see, they're all over the world and they were all punished and they paid dearly for the calendar, the temple calendar and the Sabbaths and new moons of God.
And, I understand it, the Sabbath, which is for us to keep, they play around with it because they sit there and they do things like they say, well, it's all right for a tradesman to come on my Sabbath because he's not a Christian. I'll keep the Sabbath. If he breaks it, that's on him. But really, we should push back against that, shouldn't we? Yeah. We should be telling, no, you don't come here on a Saturday. Don't do don't do the housework. Don't do the laundry. I'm not going to a restaurant. It's just like you were mentioning. They go to a restaurant because they say, well, they could be open anyway. Well, Christians should push against it. Not use those services.
It says, quite simply, you're not use your manservant or your maidservant, your ox, your ass, right, or anything that is yours. And when you engage somebody to do work for you, labour for you, and if you go to a restaurant, you're engaging them in labour, and that is a sin. And that keeping of the Sabbath is from dark Friday till dark Saturday, and from the new moon, from dark on the beginning of the new moon to dark at the end of the new moon. They are Sabbaths. And Isaiah 66, 23 and 24 says that when the Messiah gets here, we will keep the new moons from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, and those that do not will die. And Amos says there is to be no trading on Sabbaths or new moons.
And the other area too is that there can be double Sabbaths. A lot of these churches under Hillel don't want these double Sabbaths, and they'll sit there and say, not meant to have a double Sabbath. I'll just remind them, what about Pentecost?
Exactly.
Yeah, Pentecost itself is a double Sabbath.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the important structure. When the Mishnah was compiled around 200 AD, there were back-to-back Sabbaths recorded in the Mishnah. So it's not a matter of saying, we don't have back-to-back Sabbaths. Yes, we do. And the calendar has back-to-back Sabbaths all the time. And the postponement system under Hillel was brought in so that these oral traditions of the Pharisees could be enshrined into Jewish legal system and then used to negate the very laws of God in the temple calendar. The whole purpose of Hillel is to negate the laws of God in the calendar, and we better understand that.
Yeah, I mean, we've had people out there say, well, if it was a problem, Christ would have corrected it in his day. Again, it didn't come into existence.
It didn't exist. 328 years after
such
Christ
a silly argument, such a silly thing to say.
But they do it.
It wasn't even there.
Yep.
So, well, look, Wade, we go on into this paper, and of course it covers a lot of different church areas, like you had the churches in India, the Jacobites in 1625, and, again, they proved that the Sabbath was being kept in these countries, didn't they?
Yes. Well, the reality is we've got, in this text, we've got records of all the centuries taking long before the Reformation and the Jacobite system. These references go into the Sabbath churches being established in Persia and the Tigris-Euphrates basin. They kept the Sabbath, paid tithes to their churches, And you see that in the reference texts involved. And the St. Thomas Christians of India were never in communion with Rome. They kept the Sabbath and the systems there. Right. They were Sabbath keepers, as were those who broke off communion with Rome after the Council of Chalcedon, namely the Abyssinians, the Jacobites, the Maronites, and the Armenians, the Kurds who kept the food laws and denied confession and purgatory. See the Schaff-Herzog encyclopedia for that reference. In 781, the famous China monument was inscribed in marble to tell of the growth of Christianity in China. The inscription of 763 words were unearthed near the city of Chang'an in 1625 and allegedly now stands in the forest of tablets at Chang'an. The extract from the tablets states, "On the seventh day we offer sacrifices after having purified our hearts and received absolution for our sins. This religion, so perfect and so excellent, is difficult to name, but it enlightens darkness by its brilliant precepts." That's the Abbe Hugh in Christianity in China, Volume 1, Chapter 2, pages 48 to 49. Now, how the Sabbath got into China is a text in its own right that's dealt with in this text. The Bishop Muses was the leading bishop in the Abyssinian church based out of Axum and Abyssinia through Ethiopia and East Africa. That was a large church. It was Sabbath keeping. It was non-Trinitarian. In fact, we'll see that later when we deal with Islam and the first persecution when they sought refuge with the Abyssinian church in 613 in the first Hijrah. But Muses, much earlier in the beginning of the 5th century, went from Abyssinia to India and took discussing the Sabbath and bringing that into India through the churches there and communicating with the churches. He then left India and went on into China. Right. Now, that was where the Sabbath and the church, Christian church, came into China in a strong way. Muses established the church through Canton, and that system of the Unitarian Church in China was continued and became associated with the rise of the Unitarian Islamic system in Canton when the Muslims formed in their Unitarian system in Arabia under the Prophet.
Right.
So, but they were Christians, right, and they were Sabbatarian Christians under the Prophet. They weren't this system now we see as modern Islam. Right. That was absolutely forbidden. And
interesting, yeah.
It is interesting. The Chinese then developed this Sabbatarian system in China, and it stayed there right through, and it's still there now, except it was infected from America by Protestants, and it became Sabellianist.
Right.
And that, it still keeps the new moons, it keeps the Sabbaths, the new moons, and all of the holy days, and it keeps the structure, but it's Sabellianist. And in that case, it's got serious problems about the first resurrection.
Right.
And that is a serious matter for the True Jesus Church, it's called.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that became Sabellianist from the 1850s.
Right.
And that was because of American Protestantism set the rot into the church in China.
Wow, that late, 1850.
Yeah, 1850s.
So obviously the Chinese were segregated somewhat from what was happening in Europe, and all the terrible destruction was going on there at the time.
Yes.
And the Americans infected them.
Yes, but that's how it got into China.
Yeah.
And they're still there. There's over 1 million of them but they're Sabellianists, and they've got serious problems with the first resurrection now.
Right.
And then also we head into Italy, don't we?
We do.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes, the Sabbath went with the church under Linus,
Right.
and the other bishops we dealt with in 122D.
Right.
There was 4 or 5 of the 70 went into Italy, and then one of them went on into Britain and established the church in Britain. Tribes came in, the Vandals moved into Africa, the Visigoths moved into Spain, the Suevi into Portugal, and what is now Portugal, and the Ostrogoths moved into Italy. And the structure then was the reorganisation of Europe in part, but the Franks came in and they occupied what is now France, named from the Franks, and we'll now see this unifying structure saw the wars between the Unitarian Trinitarian wars, which we'll deal with in number 268, which followed the Quartodeciman disputes, and we'll deal with that warlike period when we discuss the Unitarian Trinitarian wars. But this leads us now into the development of the church in Britain and the integration of the tribes in Britain.